Morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, the second in our Generative AI series. And the topic up for discussion today is Generative AI. Can many hands make light work? So I'm Leanne Raven, Senior Knowledge Lawyer in the Employment team in London, with a keen interest in how innovative technologies are going to disrupt the working world as we know it. Today, we're going to be discussing the impact of Generative AI and AI more generally on the workplace, what issues this raises for employers from both a legal and practical perspective, and what employers need to be thinking about. I'm sure many of you will have already read some of the horror stories in the press about employees using ChatGPT in their work with potentially unexpected results. So you may have heard about the very experienced New York lawyer using ChatGPT in preparation for litigation and citing non-existent case law that ChatGPT completely made up, and that when he probed ChatGPT on whether it was reliable and true, it assured him that it was. We've had other stories about employees leaking highly sensitive data by entering confidential information into the platforms, and employers already culling jobs that they think can be done by AI. And Goldman Sachs has predicted, I think it's around 300 million full-time jobs around the world could be threatened by automation. There are lots and lots to discuss today, and I'm delighted to welcome two of our very esteemed employment partners to join us. That's Anne Preetham and Emily Aiti. Anne is a distinguished partner in the firm's UK employment practice, with many years' experience as a trusted advisor for a wide cross-section of clients. She really is a true expert in employment law and partnership law. She's a seasoned litigator and has a well-known reputation for achieving consistently positive outcomes for her clients. She has a stellar reputation in the field and is ranked in the leading legal directories, including both UK chambers and global chambers, as well as being a recommended lawyer in the Legal 500. Alongside Anne, I'm delighted to welcome partner Emily Aiti, based in Dubai, who plays a pivotal role in Stevenson Harwood's Middle East employment practice. Rightly ranked as a rising star by the Legal 500, she is renowned for her in-depth knowledge of the business and cultural environment of the Middle East, and she has been recognised as one of the leading employment practitioners in the Middle East region. So delighted to have you both here to share your thoughts with us today. The main focus of today's webinar will be how AI can permeate the employment lifecycle, so from recruitment to performance management, dismissal, and everything in between. We'll also discuss what employers should be doing now to mitigate the risks associated with its use. And finally, we'll do some crystal ball gazing about how AI might determine the future world of work. We're thinking metaverse, avatars, and beyond. We should have some time at the end for Q&A, and we've already received a question beforehand. But if you do have any more questions during the course of the webinar, please pop them in the Q&A function. So let's kick off with clarifying what we mean in brief terms when we use the terms AI and generative AI. Anne, can you kick off for us with that, please?
Sure, thanks, Leanne, and thank you for a very flattering introduction to both Emily and me. Well, in very simple terms, artificial intelligence refers to the development of computer systems which are able to perform tasks which normally would require human intelligence, and it's a part of computer science that makes machines think and learn like humans. It's used to make computers do things like recognize speech, learn, plan, and solve problems. The distinction with generative AI is that it's a type of artificial intelligence, it's a subset, but it can actually create new content. It's a system trained on a large amount of data, training data, and it generates new data that's similar to what it's been trained on. So the probably best known example is ChatGPT. I've recently heard that referred to as being sentence completion on steroids. So when your phone predicts text, it's actually doing roughly the same thing. It's assessing what you're most likely to say next. It doesn't actually know what you're going to say next, of course. It's predicting what you will say and what you are most likely to say. And of course, that likelihood, rather than the accuracy of prediction, is where some of the issues start to creep in with generative artificial intelligence.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I think some of these terms are thrown around, but it's just quite useful to pin down what we're talking about today when we're using those terms. So that's really helpful. So let's start looking at this through an employment lens, and begin at the start of the employment life cycle, so applications and recruitment. And how do you see generative AI impacting on this?
Well, let's maybe start at the very beginning of the life cycle, the candidate applying for a job. And I think it's worth thinking about your first impression of a candidate. It's usually via a cover letter. Could that cover letter actually not be written by the candidate, but by generative AI? So, for example, you might see candidates copying and pasting a job description into ChatGPT or an equivalent system, and then asking the AI to create a cover letter and reword a CV. So, for example, I ran an application for a vacancy that we have in our own team, and told it the job description for an associate in our team, and it came up with a very impressive sort of cover letter telling me why I should employ this person who doesn't exist. Why does it matter? Well, as long as what people are saying is truthful and they're using AI to support a document that they're creating, maybe that's actually a desirable skill for a job you're recruiting for. You maybe want someone who can use AI and tailor it to their task. But you do perhaps want to think about, would you want people to declare that? And if algorithmic software is actually scanning CVs for keywords, then savvy applicants will know what those keywords are likely to be and will be able to hit the mark, as it were. And interestingly, we actually had a real life example of this. We had a client who was talking about a trainee task which they'd set to 2 people in completely different places around the world. And they'd come up with 2 very similar outcomes, almost certainly as a result of both using ChatGPT. So what we're probably looking for, rather than avoiding the use of AI in applications, is for you to really sift out people who are using it well. Wouldn't you really rather have who's actually able to use it well on the job, then tech to the task and use it effectively, bypass time-consuming human input? Why? Time is money, after all. And if they're also able to keep on top of the flaws in the tech and its risks, it's probably a good thing. And actually, we're seeing the emergence of a brand new job description, which is an interesting one, which is prompt engineers. And they're people who can essentially coax AI platforms to produce the best outcomes. So if you've played around with ChatGPT or another platform, you'll know it's not always easy to get exactly what you want out of it. But a prompt engineer is someone who can manipulate language, not a computer geek, almost certainly in English or a philosophy or a history graduate, somebody like that, who uses language and manipulates it to get the best out of AI systems.
Absolutely. And I think in talking about recruitment and the application process, there's quite a lot written already about discrimination in that sphere. In a non-AI way, this might be something like unconscious bias creeping in, where people have an unconscious bias towards people who look like them or have a similar background to them, and that sort of thing. We've seen that the implementation of AI doesn't necessarily eliminate this, but it could in fact exacerbate it. Would you agree, Anne?
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, this is one of the slightly uglier sides of what AI can do. It can actually increase bias and makes it harder to spot, because machines make their errors in different ways from the way that humans make their errors and make their judgments. So you may have seen recently there was a story reported by the BBC regarding a potentially biased algorithm which Amazon was using in recruitment. And the AI system was trained on data which had been submitted by applicants over a 10-year period. But most of those applicants in the 10-year period, and most of those who'd been successful, were men. So the system taught itself that male candidates were actually preferable, and it ended up down marking, penalising CVs that included the word women. So if you said, for example, you'd been captain of the women's chess club or you'd attended a women's college, it actually marked you down for those elements of your CV. So that all fed into the process with obviously quite undesirable outcomes. And then there's perhaps a subtler form of AI, which is based around image recognition, facial recognition software, which, if it's used in an interview process, which you might carry out like this on screen, will actually recognize body language and facial cues. But a lot of the AI fact sets on which these systems are trained are predominantly white. So it recognizes the facial cues and body language of white faces and white people. So if you think about the different meanings that body language and facial expressions can carry in different cultures around the world, where a nod can mean one thing in one country and something completely different in another, then you can see that there are potentially a lot of problems about using AI for that sort of assessment and measurement. It's worth saying, some of our viewers may be sitting there thinking, we don't use AI in our recruitment. If you use recruitment agents, certainly if you use one of the big scale recruitment agents, you should probably ask them if you are using AI in your recruitment, because most of them already use these systems. They use them to weed out unpromising candidates, usually in an early sift. And you should definitely be making it your job to understand what your agents are doing, because they are exactly that. They are agents, and you don't want them making decisions based on AI that perhaps don't accord with the company's values. Now, there's a simple overlay to all of this, a legal overlay, which is that a decision cannot be made for recruitment based on an automated system alone. And many in the audience would already know that. There has to be a human intervention by law. So you cannot just use a machine to make those decisions. But what I think really comes up for debate with AI coming onto the scene in the form that it is now, this very sophisticated generative AI, as it becomes more human, in large quotation marks, it's a question of how meaningful does the human intervention have to be on top of the machine interventions. What instructions are you giving your agents around what human intervention they put into that system and process? Are you happy they're doing that in accordance with your values? Or is it possible that decisions are being made on behalf of your company that actually don't really fit with what the company would like to stand for? So we see discrimination bias creeping in as data on which ChatGPT and other systems have been trained begins to create its own inherent biases and can be reflected in the output. And that is, frankly, a dangerous precedent that we're beginning to set.
Okay, so that's a really key issue to be aware of, that actually the discrimination and bias within the data that ChatGPT has been trained on. And a little later we'll come on to talk about some of the other risks that we can see emerging. But to carry on the journey of the employment life cycle, so let's assume we've had our applicant, maybe they've used generative AI in producing their CV and cover letter. They've got through the algorithms of the interview. We've offered them, they've accepted some employment, and now they're in employment with us. What do you think employers should be thinking about with regard to generative AI during somebody's employment?
Well, I think this comes into play when you're looking at how an employee is productive in their role and what their performance measures are. Quite a lot of jobs, particularly with the introduction of things like smart targets, we're all told things must be measurable, they must be achievable, realistic, targeted, etc., etc. There is an issue there in that if, for example, you have a marketing executive and you say that their success will be measured by how many brochures or pitch documents they generate per month, maybe they have to produce a certain number of social media posts. What if they are actually getting a generative AI system to do that for them? What if ChatGPT is actually churning out that material for them? Now, that can be done literally 100 times faster at the press of a button once you've got the system to work the way you want it to. How do you assess performance on the back of that? Do you say, that's fine, we don't mind that you do a first draft through ChatGPT? Or do you say that actually we want to be clear that this is your own work? And are we looking more at qualitative assessment of performance than maybe quantitative? Because AI can take care of the quantity for people, it can't necessarily take care of the quality. And actually, interesting, I had my own example of this very recently. The overgeneration and sort of hallucinatory effects of AI, which sounds like I've been on drugs, but I haven't, where I came back from a conference and I'd collected a lot of contacts, I'd spoken to a lot of people, we had the delegate list, and what I did was I typed it all into a Word document, names of certain lawyers, countries they'd come from, but I did it as we went along at the conference, so it was a complete jumble by the end of 3 days. I fed that into ChatGPT and asked it to put everybody in order of country and to put everybody down with their then by surname in alphabetical order and to put their firm next to their name. Did a brilliant job first time round. I then asked it to change that a little bit, to change instead of alphabetical order of surname, to put it in alphabetical order of the firms of the people I'd met, the companies they were with. At which point my list of 60 contacts went up to about 85. And essentially ChatGPT had decided it'd be really helpful to tell me I'd met a whole load of people I hadn't met. and it had pulled names off the internet that fitted with the other names on the list. And because this was a multinational conference of employment lawyers, yes, such things really do exist, suddenly I had another extra people on the list some of whom I actually know, but I was absolutely certain I had not met at the conference. So it really can hallucinate. It can try to help you just that little bit too much. And I think that's where employers need to be keeping a real sort of control on what employees are using it for, and are they keeping tabs on that? Because it would have been only too easy to wave that through, not really check it and assume it was all correct, and then have inaccurate data basically fixed in our system going forward that I had met certain people on those days when I just simply hadn't. And it can arise, of course, as an issue, not just in performance, but I think during the life cycle of employment, we could be looking at straightforward discrimination. And I have a little bit of a, as it were, bee in my bonnet, and forgive me indulging my sort of passion on this point, but I think there is an issue around the way that employment law approaches the question of discrimination and what artificial intelligence can generate. And the fact that if you are saying that you have been discriminated against in your job as an individual, you're essentially using a comparative exercise. By definition, discrimination is a comparative complaint. It's saying I've been treated less well than this person, who in all the similar characters has all the similar circumstances to me, except my protected characteristic. Now, with the growth of AI, you could create a comparator for yourself by pumping in artificial data sets, synthetic data, which a lot of people would say would offset bias in a system, but which actually then means that you have the perfect comparator to bring a discrimination claim. So you've come sort of full circle with an artificial discrimination complaint. And I appreciate, as I say, that's a little bit of a rabbit hole, and it's a bee in my bonnet to mix my animal metaphors, but it's something that I think is quite an interesting little legal point that we're going to need to watch going forward.
I think, yeah, certainly right, especially if you're kind of an employment law enthusiast like us. That really is something interesting to watch out for. So staying with discrimination for a moment, we've talked about AI and generative AI and how it can exacerbate discrimination and bias. But, and Emily, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do we think there are ways that generative AI can be a help in this regard rather than a hindrance?
Yes, I think so. I mean, on the flip side of what Anne's just discussed, I think AI, specifically generative AI, could be relevant as a tool to actually minimise discrimination by alleviating workplace disadvantages for employees who have disabilities. And we know many of our clients, employers in many jurisdictions, are legally obligated to make reasonable adjustments to remove those disadvantages. And that could well include assistive technology, including things like ChatGPT and other AI chatbots. And in that context, it's always incumbent on employers to try and think laterally about what kind of adjustments can be made. And it's certainly not a great leap of the imagination to see that this technology could be of benefit. So, for example, if you have employees with visual or hearing impairments, and they can submit images or messages, questions, and get the responses in a form that suits their needs, whether that's written text or verbally. Or another example could be dyslexic or autistic employees, other employees who find writing fluent emails in a particular style challenging. And if ChatGPT or other chatbots can more easily understand even poorly written commands, that might have grammatical or spelling errors, and create something that's more refined to include all the common niceties that might be expected in a professional or workplace setting, then we can definitely see some benefit there. And that's just not, I mean, we're talking about in the course of employment, but also going back to the recruitment stage, the obvious example of where you have employers using assessments as part of the recruitment process, perhaps making generative AI available there. I mean, it's not always going to be clear what's going to be the most effective way to make generative AI assist employees with accessibility and productivity. But that obligation on employers to make reasonable adjustments is going to be something to keep in mind and be prepared to proactively promote its use potentially and see how you can best improve participation in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that also forms part of the broader scope for employers. determining whether generative AI platforms should actually be deployed to help their staff perform their roles more effectively and efficiently. Do you agree, Emily?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of employers are at crossroads at the moment and deciding whether or not to deploy ChatGPT at all. A lot of talk about wary employers who are thinking about banning it or have banned it. Apple, for example, they brought in restrictions for their employees earlier this year, and that's primarily to avoid those accidental disclosures of confidential information. I just query whether that's going to be a sustainable position to take, and I think realistically we try to accept that this is the future, or now really, and instead start thinking about how employers can use it to the benefit of their organisation, especially if employees are going to use it anyway, and simply ensure that employees have at least an appropriate level of training and direction in how to use it at work.
Yeah, I agree. I think employers are most likely to be better off trying to equip their workforces with the right skills rather than trying to ban it because they're concerned about it or don't understand it or not quite sure how it works. But I suppose then the question is, if you do want your employees to use it, is training going to be important there then?
Yeah, I mean, I myself spent some time looking at it, training myself up, but I don't think employers should assume that there is going to be a common level of awareness even or understanding of how these types of applications are going to work. And obviously, depending on the company's approach to its usage, it would make sense to provide probably at least a basic level of introductory training to all employees so that they do understand the functionality and the potential capabilities and implications for their tasks. When you are, or if you are going to roll out training, then employers should be thinking about how regular that training may need to be. We've talked about how fast this technology is developing, so likely to need some kind of refreshers as the tech develops and as the organization's own approach to using that tech adjusts over time. And over that time, you're going to be thinking about which roles can or can't use AI or generative AI for their work, and that's something that will be kept under review along with the types of tasks that would be appropriate for its use. And then if you are going to roll out a training program, thinking about who's going to be responsible for designing the scheme or the program or the content, should that be your line manager? Should it be someone who's a bit closer to the work, the direct supervisor? I mean, ideally, you would want inputs from different parts of the business to make sure that it's appropriate for the various employees you have using it. And then speaking of management, thinking about whether you need to differentiate the content of that training to give certain emphasis to tasks or decisions that management might need to make and understand apart from the wider employees using it day to day.
Okay, so in terms of the training, I think we've talked so far mainly about training to get effective use of generative AI. But would you also be encouraging employers to educate employees about the business risks of using generative AI and how to minimize such risks?
Yeah, I mean, the training needs to be appropriate so that employees input appropriate prompts when they are trying to generate content for work tasks, and making sure that employees fully appreciate the legal risks involved in what they're doing. We've talked about the risks of disclosure of company confidential and other sensitive information and personal data. And so it's important to flag that, employees using the outputs from ChatGPT or other programs unchecked or just over relying on the output can present risks, especially given that certain versions of ChatGPT are only trained on data up to a certain date. That's not every version, but different organizations may adopt a different version. So that means that data or the program can't fact recent events or information that may be relevant to the task at hand. So this is going to have a bearing on accuracy and relevancy of the content being generated, and employees need to be conscious and aware of the limitations of the technology. So an employer's role is kind of there to help them understand why. and also why it's going to be important for employees to be honest about their use, so that they're not simply passing it off as their own, whether that's internally or externally. So trying to find ways to mitigate those risks around not only that, but also infringing potentially third-party IP rights, intellectual property, and also copyright issues. And our colleagues are going to talk a bit more about that next week, I think.
Yeah, that's the next part in our series. So from what you're saying, Emily, I think it seems like it's crucial that both employers and employees understand the risks that are posed by use of generative AI. And it's a really key point, because I think many might just be blinded by the increased productivity. As I mentioned earlier, the example with the marketing assistant, suddenly there you are 100 times faster, you can produce all of this. There is a danger people are blinded by that and a bit cavalier about any risks. And I think we've probably all seen the attention-grabbing headlines about AI taking over your job and replacing certain professions, and the question about the battle of supremacy between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. Emily, what's your take on that narrative?
Well, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do question whether or how far our human emotional intelligence can be replicated by generative AI. And again, potential issues thrown up if employees don't fully appreciate the limitations of the content being generated, and that there is going to have to be some application of brain to the tasks going forward. So, perhaps not in relation to all jobs or all tasks, where certainly ChatGPT and the like will help bring efficiencies to creation of routine content. But I think we have to remember that, as Anne said, ChatGPT creates content based on probability and I guess what's happened in the past, and what the likely outcome should be. So my question is, to what extent will it be able to actually assess the nuances of specific circumstances, and make appropriate decisions on the output? Again, especially where training data may be out of date, and not fully current. So, is an AI tool capable of applying that emotional intelligence to it to any degree? And I think for now, we still need to be conscious that employees should be engaged, and need to provide that discerning eye to weed out bias from the data sets that are fed into these programs. ChatGPT isn't a sentient being. It can't read between the lines in the way that a human does. As far as I'm aware, it can't. It can't provide that personal touch. So I think ultimately, for now, certainly a lack of appreciation of these potential shortcomings could lead to real legal risk for any business.
Okay, so I think key message is we shouldn't be underestimating the importance of the human touch and emotional intelligence. And I suppose, the need for human oversight is crucial, which I'm sure all of us are relieved to hear. I think that's true at both an individual level, an organisational level, and even at a broader regulatory level. Anne, I'd like to bring you back in here to talk about how do you see that human oversight working, and what checks and balances kind of need to be put in place?
I think regulation is a really difficult sphere in this area. And it's fair to say, I think we now know that one of the root causes of the financial crisis of 2008 was that, 2008 was that those at the top of organisations often didn't really understand what those at the bottom were doing in the financial sector. And the practical reality was that there were many very clever, very able senior bankers who just didn't understand how some of the derivative products that their very clever, very able junior people were creating and trading were actually structured, and that they were effectively houses built on sand in some instances. So there is a concern that generative AI will pose similar issues, that senior managers and the people at the very top of organisations may not have that hands-on knowledge, may not have that grip of what generative AI actually creates and how it generates its content and what its potential flaws are, where the data sets can be problematic and so forth. And they're not necessarily going to know when generative AI is being used or abused. Now, there's been a reaction, as you would expect, from governments around the world to these developments. And in the field of regulation, we're really seeing a bit of a dichotomy. classically between the EU approach and that of the US. And it seems that the UK, in classic fashion, again, will probably try to sit in the middle of the pond on this. And in the EU, the likelihood is that almost all forms of interaction with AI in the workplace will be regulated. So there's discussion that works councils in European states will have to approve any use of generative AI in any context in the workplace. So if it's used for performance, for productivity management, if it's used for recruitment and so forth, that works councils, therefore union reps, must be consulted on that, must agree the rules of play. Now, that's a process-driven approach that labels pretty much every touch point as a potential risk to data protection, and that's where it's really coming from as an issue. Whereas in the US, a much broader brush approach seems to be being taken generally, that in the US, again, as is typical of their regimes, they're looking at an outcomes-based regime where the question of how far you regulate generative AI usage will be driven by the outcome of that usage and the purpose to which you're putting your use of the generative AI. And of course, that begs the question for organizations looking at regulation at the sort of organizational level, is whether you have a clear policy that sets out the guidelines of what's acceptable in the workplace, how generative AI can be used, when it should not be used, what employees are entitled to be told about whether the data is being used in AI data banks. And that's really a key point and something employers should be thinking about. Of course, employees will want to know whether you're using AI to monitor them or not. And by the same token, you want to know whether they're using AI to do their work. So it's interesting, I recently attended a presentation at the Employment Lawyers Conference in which the in-house employment lawyer at Microsoft was talking about how they are dealing with generative AI in the workplace. And he said one of his biggest concerns, what keeps him up at night, is change management, is really adjusting the way in which people adopt to generative AI in the workplace, how they're going to use it, and that there is consistency across the organization. And he said, of course, frequently you're really coming up against something as old-fashioned as individual managers' level of interest in these things. Some individual managers are fascinated by generative AI. They want to adopt it. They want to bring it into play. They're very encouraging of employees who do so. Others really just want to ignore it and feel that what they've been doing to date is absolutely fine, and why challenge it? So I think there are some very interesting issues ahead in terms of how employers regulate that space.
Yeah, I totally agree. I suppose there will be pockets of the workforce, or who, enthusiastic, interested, wanting to leap ahead, and others who might be a little more wary. So I suppose really it comes down to, you talk about consistency, and having some sort of guidelines, principles, and a policy is really going to be pivotal here. Through what a policy might look like, what kind of areas you'd expect it to cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd want to, as with all good HR policies, set the scene at least, and the background of why you're having a policy. So it's there to provide guidelines for using generative AI, and explaining what the technology is. As we said, not all employees will necessarily know that much about it or how it works. You'll probably want to present the benefits for the business, and also, as we said, flag the dangers of its use around potential bias and the risks of over-reliance on outdated data. In terms of providing for the fact that these are early days, you want to make sure that ideally it's not a contractual policy, so that you've got space to adjust the company's approach as things develop without being contractually constrained. Also provide some scope about who the policy applies to. So, you know, that you may well have commercial agreements where work is outsourced, and that may touch on generative AI. And likewise, as an employer, you want to think about who else, apart from your employees, in-house and casual staff, the policy will apply to. Are you going to include external individuals? Probably. So thinking about contractors, consultants, agency workers, even interns, and that's wherever they may be in the world. And I say that because I'm thinking of the prospect for there to be competing guidelines or even restrictions. We know in Italy that ChatGPT was briefly banned earlier this year. It's always good practice to say who's the owner of the policy. So who do employees go to if they've got questions or even want to flag concerns or gaps in the content in your policy? That could be someone in HR, or tech, even risk or compliance teams, innovation, legal. Perhaps there's a committee of all of those individuals, and perhaps it's the chair of that committee who you go to for any queries.
Okay, so that's really helpful. So setting out the scope of the policy, who applies to, the status, contractual, non-contractual, and ownership. So they're all really key areas. In terms of the actual use of generative AI, do you see it being quite prescriptive or covering kind of how it can be used, by whom, when, etc.?
Yeah, you definitely want to set out which applications your employees are allowed to use if you want to be prescriptive. So is it ChatGPT, Google's Bard, Bing Chat? Of course, you'll want to keep that list under review as well as new applications and collaborations enter that space. Setting some parameters around accessing those applications. So do employees have to use their work email account? Who can use it? Which roles may use ChatGPT and the like? Or, is it going to be open? Or do you think actually just because of the inherent nature of the work of certain employees that there's just a disproportionate risk in allowing them to use it? We talked about the emotional intelligence gap. So reminding employees in the policy that, there is an expectation on them to apply their minds to what comes out in the output and not simply using the content unchecked. So some firm guidelines around accuracy and human review, making sure that emails that are created are adjusted for tone and to take account of factual nuances and the relationships involved in those on that chain of communication. And then on the flip side of that is then to say what you can't use generative AI for. So I talked about certain emails. Perhaps you say anything but routine repetitive messages can't be generated using this program. And that's really to avoid, tone deaf or insensitive or impersonal communications, which could bring with it the risk of sparking complaints around bullying even, or harassment or discrimination, perhaps. And then, of course, to ban its use for tasks that involve personal data or confidential information.
Yeah, I think that confidential information point is really key. And there was a recent story about Samsung and employees unwittingly leaking top secret data because they used ChatGPT to help them with tasks. So they used it to help them fix problems with their source code, but in doing so, inputted the confidential information and leaked that. So I think, confidential information, that's going to be something at the top of the list for employers to think about.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's a really early cautionary tale. So a very key caveat to make that all use is going to be subject to that strict prohibition on using confidential information, given what we know about the loss of privacy and ownership once the data's fed in. And on the same vein of ownership, there are also IP issues to be considered and perhaps flagged in your policy if you're going to have one. Will employees need to label that they've used ChatGPT? Is that an internal requirement or where it's going to be sent externally? Perhaps there'll be some discretion for line managers to make the final decision. And that's where the training is really going to be important for them to understand how to exercise that kind of discretion day to day. So there's some oversight for trainees, training and managers supervising that work. You'll want to perhaps flag in the policy that there will be a policing of its use. Of course, that's subject to any data protection or privacy issues involved, but yes, perhaps reserving the right to monitor use. I suppose we've talked about training, so you might flag that in the contract necessarily, but in the policy, whether that's going to be a mandatory requirement before employees can use it. Perhaps there will be a certain pass mark or a declaration of understanding. Again, you might want to flag that in your policy. And just that comes to mind best because of where I am, but just thinking about any local or regional considerations, taking account of business operations you have around the world. So are you going to have a global policy, or do you need to have separate policies to take account of local settings? For example, well, I'm sitting here in the Middle East. I would imagine local employers wanting to be extra cautious with warning against the potential for perhaps inappropriate materials to be generated. And we know, if you look in the interface on ChatGPT, it does say they won't accept inappropriate prompts, but who sets the bar? And will that be sufficient for local standards or expectations around decency and inappropriate materials?
Okay, so that's really helpful, canter through some of the things we expect to include in policies. And have we seen clients asking for policies?
We have, starting to come through. I think clients are at different points in their understanding of generative AI and the potential impact. Decide whether you go into detail or have anything at all. On the one hand, you want something that's quite prescriptive with detailed guidelines going through all the points that we've kind of discussed today, or do you have something that's much more high level, setting out general expectations for users to exercise caution in the way they apply use the applications for work. So something more that's akin to a code of conduct in the first instance.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We're nearly going to be wrapping up. But would you like to say a few words? Or I talked about crystal ball gazing at the beginning. What type of issues do you think employers might be seeing coming across their desk in the future and the kind of wider AI sphere?
Well, things are developing at a pace. So who knows where this will take us in the future? But I think one direction we probably know things are moving into is the use of AI to generate realistic avatars. So these are graphical representations of a person. And just one of the questions we were discussing is, what if people are using their avatars to conduct interactions with their colleagues or externally? Could there be risk of negligence claims because speech generated for these avatars is hallucinating and completely fabricating events or information? Will there be avatar-based misconduct due to speech generated in collaboration with ChatGPT or any other AI platform?
I'd agree with that, Emily. I think the whole concept of avatars and there being perhaps a separate workplace in the metaverse is really fascinating. And if that sounds really outlandish, I think you only need to watch a teenager on their Xbox or their PlayStation trying on different skins in a game of Halo or Fortnite, and you'll see that this concept of changeable avatars, changeable identities, is actually second nature to some of our youngest generations. And this question of misconduct is interesting, but of course it could be positive. So for some people, trying on a new avatar may be reflecting their questions about their own sexuality, questions about their gender identity and so forth. Maybe that will be a positive way in which they can express themselves in a metaverse, which they don't feel they can do in a physical workplace. So we have to remember that this will have upsides, but of course there may be misconduct. Of course, you can't blame an avatar for misconduct. An avatar is still an employee underneath, and avatars that go around sort of groping each other by the water cooler are still employees behaving badly at the end of the day, and that still has the same disciplinary sanctions. But it's a really interesting development that I think is down the track, and not so far down the track either.
Absolutely, I think there is a interesting future that lies ahead, and lots of queries from an employment point of view that are going to be raised. We're actually just out of time, so I'm going to offer anybody who has any further questions, if you want to contact us directly after the webinar by email, or our contact details are on our website with the invitations, then please do feel free to do that. Thank you so much to Emily and Anne for your insightful input today, and I'd encourage our audience to sign up for the next webinar next week, where our fantastic intellectual property colleagues are going to be delving into some of the IP issues. So thank you for listening, thank you for joining, and have a good rest of your day.